That's on the third line. The fourth line is a line that illustrates the cycles of the church over the last 200 years, from the 17th century on forward, 1750. And I will explain more of that to you later, so don't try to figure it all out right now. But it explains what causes church divisions, when they happen, what they happen about, and what makes the church divisions come about. It's an analytical study, and it is dated because, as you can see, those symbols there, the triangles and the squares and the rectangles, they all have a significant bearing on the behavior of the church in the last 250 years. And I'll try to go over that with you sometime when we can have more time to explain what each one of those symbols means. But the value of this is you can look back over the past 250 years and you can extrapolate that into the future and tell what's going to happen in coming years. And we'll try to get into that. We've got some question marks there in the right-hand lower corner, and we'll try to deal with those question marks when we get into it. Okay, everybody, put your outlines away. You can sit on them, put them in your Bible or whatever. And I'd like for you to give some attention to what we're going to be talking about today. We only have 20 minutes for this study, and it's going to be tough to get it in. Let's get underway. We're down, having gone through 3,400 years of biblical history, and we're down to the last 600 years before the coming of Christ. And this is a very difficult period because the first 200 years of those 600 years are involving a lot of different things. And one thing is you're involving a lot of distance, because there was something like from 600 to 800 miles from Jerusalem to the capitals of the Assyrian Empire and the capital of the Babylonian Empire. So time and distance has a whole lot to do with what goes on during this period of time. And today we're going to talk about 200 years from BC 600 to 400. And this is a very busy time. And the reason it's busy is because of the time and distance, and because of the number of characters that are involved, and the activities they have going on, and the number of books of the Old Testament that record these events. If I can just briefly mention, the last 600 years, biblically speaking, addresses, and this, especially this 200-year time zone, is addressed by Obadiah, who was one of the early minor prophets that talked about the period from 600 on following. And then you had Daniel came on the scene, and then Ezekiel came, and after that you had Haggai and Zechariah, and then you had Esther, the book of Esther, and Ezra, which came in about the same time frame in the mid 400s BC. And then after that you had the book of Nehemiah, book of Zechariah and Malachi, and they had a lot of significant interactions, but you have to read all of those books to put the events together, because none of the books give the complete story like 1st and 2nd Kings give of the kingdom period. So we'll look at all of those, and I'm going to try to tie it together for you and give you the highlights of it, and then you can take your outline and look up your own biblical studies and read what you would like to. The main event occurred when Nebuchadnezzar took over the power of the Assyrian Empire, which occurred somewhere around 606 BC. And then he immediately went over to threaten the empire of the Egyptian power structure, and had a battle at Carchemish, which is in the extreme northern part of the land of Palestine, which today would be in Turkey. And he fought a battle there at Carchemish and defeated the Egyptians and broke the back of the power of the Egyptian dynasties for many, many years. And so when he did that in 606 or 605 BC, then he came down to Jerusalem after Sennacherib had come down, and Sennacherib had defeated the Syrians and conquered Damascus, and he had come down to do the same for Judea, but God forbade it, and God's angel came down and killed 180,000 of Sennacherib's troops that had come down from Assyria. So God was still watching over the Israelites at that time. However, they had been so steeped in idolatry and had disappointed God so long until he had prophesied through Jeremiah and through Daniel and some of the other prophets, Isaiah, that he was going to give up on them and let them go into captivity. Well, the northern kingdom, as you know, went into Syrian captivity. The southern kingdom now is going to be taken over by Nehemiah. After he defeated the Egyptians at Carchemish, he came down to Judea and told his generals to get all of the royalty out of Jerusalem that had any talent, any skill, any educational experience, and any nobility, and take them to Babylon, which was his capital. And so they did so, and Daniel was, and also Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's the Babylonian names. Their Jewish or Hebrew names was Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael. And they were changed when they got to Babylon to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So those were taken into captivity immediately, right prior to 600 BC. Then, right after that, Nebuchadnezzar's army came to Jerusalem and encamped about it, besieged it, and conquered it in 597 BC. And at that point, this is where I think that Ezekiel was taken captive. Some think that he was taken off with Daniel, but I really think he was an older man and was taken later. And he was taken to Babylon along with thousands of the Jewish captives and inhabitants of Jerusalem. And that captivity started conquering Judea, but it wasn't finished until 586 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar came back, and with his army, he not only took everybody that left in Jerusalem captive, but he destroyed the temple, he broke down the walls, he burned the temple of God, took all the metals and everything that was of any value out of it, carried it to Babylon, and that was the end of the Jewish reign in Israel for the next 70 years. This began the 70 years of captivity. And as time runs out, that captivity went from 586 BC to 516 BC, when Zerubbabel came back and began construction of the temple in Jerusalem, laid the foundation, and they had the dedication of the foundation in 516 BC, which accounted for 70 years that Jeremiah prophesied and that Daniel prophesied would be the duration of the Babylonian captivity. Now, many things happened in Babylon, and we just have time to briefly refer to them, but Daniel was a key player in Babylon, and he came to Babylon at an early age, and he lived to be an old man in Babylon. He was living under the rule of the Hebrew kingdom of Judea. Then he was taken to Babylon and put in power in the city of Babylon. He lived in that reign. Then he was there when Cyrus conquered Babylon in 539 BC. And then he lived further to see Cyrus grant the Jewish people return back to Jerusalem. So he lived in at least 4 different governmental reigns and regimes, I guess you'd call it. And he remained powerful in each one and also faithful in each one. Well, he became powerful to Nebuchadnezzar because he had the power of God within him, and he could interpret dreams. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream that troubled him a whole lot, but he couldn't even tell the magicians and the soothsayers and the Chaldeans and the people who normally could interpret his dreams. He couldn't even tell them the dreams. But he threatened them all with death, and they were fixing to kill them all, and Daniel heard about it. He said, wait a minute, don't kill them. Let me see if I can handle that. And you know the story about Daniel interpreting the dream of the king. The dream was that there was a great image with a golden head and silver arms and so forth, and clay and iron, and then clay feet, and a stone without hands was carved out of the mountain and went down the mountain and hit the image and crushed it and broke it into pieces. Nebuchadnezzar couldn't tell the dream nor the interpretation, but Daniel told them the dream and the interpretation. And this is very significant to each of us who are Christians today, because this is Daniel giving the prophecy that brought about the kingdom that brought you here this morning. And this was in 585 or 80 BC, and now here we are 2,500 years later, realizing the fulfillment of that prophecy. And the prophecy was, the image was depicting the 4 empires that would be coming after, and that those 4 empires were the Babylonian Empire, the Grecian Empire, and the Roman Empire. And they were coming after the Babylonian and the Syrian Empire had already occurred. And did I miss one? What did I miss?
You said Babylonian, Grecian, and Roman.
You didn't say Syrian Empire too?
The Syrian Empire preceded that. It was before the Babylonian Empire. Anyway, there were 4 empires, and I'll straighten that out if I missed it. But these empires actually occurred. The Babylonian Empire, there's the Persian, Medo-Persian Empire. And that was the one that conquered the Babylonian Empire. They conquered that empire in 539 BC. And Cyrus came over and defeated the Babylonian powers, and then Darius became the king of Babylon, and he's the one that was responsible for the edict that put Daniel in the lion's den. Well, many of us may think Daniel was kind of a young upstart because he was violating the laws of the land and praying to God every day. But at that time, he must have been at least 85 years old. And when he was put in the lion's den, he was no young kitten at the time. And so Darius took high favor for Daniel and was concerned about the story of the lion's den, which we won't have time to retell. But in the book of Daniel, you have the vision or the interpretation of the destruction of the great image, which was now, I can recall them, the Babylonian, the Medo-Persian, the Grecian, and the Roman Empire. And those were, at the present time, in present tense or future tense. Well, we know by looking ahead, which we will do in our next session if we continue. And when we look at that, we'll see the Medo-Persian Empire come to an end, and it's taken over by the Grecian Empire. That was done by Alexander the Great in 335 BC, and we'll get into that later. And it's also prefaced by the stories in the book of Nehemiah and the book of Esther, and where the kings, Darius the first, went out and fought against the Grecians, and they had some pretty powerful battles there at Marathon and at Spartus, and lost those battles. Eventually killed the father of Alexander the Great. He had a long story about it, so he came over and conquered the whole Persian Empire, all the way from Greece to the Indian Ocean. That's the banking area north and all the way down to the Indian Ocean. Back to the current event. Cyrus came in and all the time he was praising God, and God made him tells about Jeremiah especially saying, when you get to Jerusalem, even though he didn't live to go there, he was in Jerusalem when Nebuchadnezzar took the last captivities. Then he went to Egypt. But he said, when you get to Babylon, go ahead and marry and have children and raise up an abundance of kids. And then Zechariah tells us that they were to go there and become merchants, and they did become merchants. And they brought their merchant skill back to Jerusalem. And the Jewish nation rebuilt itself, and also the Jewish influence in Egypt was great. And Egypt became a great power during the intertestament period that the Bible doesn't have any recording left on. So that's basically the recovery from the taking of the children of Israel from Judea to Babylon, the time in Babylon, and many, many stories happened there. The story of Nebuchadnezzar and the great tree, and the story of the worshiping the image of Nebuchadnezzar, the fire furnace story. You remember that one? That occurred during the Babylonian captivity. And then the story of Daniel in the lion's den occurred in Daniel chapter 6. So each one of those chapters in Daniel had a story. And then the last thing I mentioned today, the books of Daniel and Ezekiel give a preview or foreknowledge of the end times. I might change that to say not the end time, but the time of the end. And the book of Revelation records almost with a high degree of similarity the story that Ezekiel recorded in the first 2 or 3 chapters of his writing, and that Daniel recorded in chapter 7 of his writing and following. And so you can tell that John, the revealer of the story in the book of Revelation, had read those books of the prophecy, and much of his imagery almost is a copy of the imagery from Ezekiel and from the book of Daniel. So that ends our study today. Our time is over, and thank you for listening, and forgive me of my mistakes because I'm doing this from memory, and I'm not using notes and haven't been. And also, some of these dates are varying from time to time from different scholars, but we're getting close to it.
You're going to do the intertestament period next week?
I can if you want me to.
I think I know less about that than anything.
Well, it involves a period of 400 years, and the Bible doesn't have anything to say about that. I might say you might ought to look into the books of apocryphy, because they have a good bit of fairly worthy points of history. And there's several there, but I won't mention them right now, that we need to look at that help us with the Maccabean period, which is covered in the period of the Intertestament period. Thank you again for being here. And now you can